My name is Alina Thorne, and exactly 10 minutes ago, I watched my older brother, Julian, raise a crystal flute of vintage champagne to toast my absolute ruin. We were sitting in the sun-drenched dining room of our family's estate in Savannah, Georgia, a room that smelled of expensive beeswax and ancient, polished secrets. My brother stood at the head of the table, his smile wide and predatory, flanked by his fiancée, Chloe, who looked like she'd already spent the inheritance in her head. Julian tapped his glass, the chime cutting through the chatter of 30 relatives, and announced, "Mom and Dad have made their final decision. The entire coastal portfolio, all 12 luxury waterfront estates, has been left to me. Alina, they've decided you've built such a colorful life in Chicago that you won't be needing the burden of the family business. You get nothing." The room erupted. My cousins cheered, my aunts leaned in to kiss Julian's cheek, and my mother actually dabbed a tear of pride from her eye. The betrayal was a physical weight, a suffocating heat that should have crushed me. But I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just waited for the noise to die down, looked my father straight in his eyes, and said, "That's a bold speech, Julian. But Dad, you forgot to check the foundation before you started building your castle, didn't you?" The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Julian's grin froze. My father's fork stopped midair. In that heartbeat, everyone realized the script they had rehearsed for months was about to be burned to ashes. Before I tell you exactly what my father forgot and how I turned this victory party into their worst nightmare, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I want to know who else has sat at a table full of people who claim to love you right before they try to erase you. If you've ever had to hold your breath while your family celebrated your downfall, hit that like button. Trust me, what happened next made every single person in that room regret clapping so fast. To understand how we got to that table, you have to understand the Thorne family. In Savannah, we were royalty. We owned the history, the land, and the look of the city. My brother Julian was the golden child, the high school star, the one who stayed close to home to manage our great-aunt Martha's massive real estate empire. My parents didn't just love him, they worshipped the ground he walked on because he was the mirror that reflected the success they wanted the world to see. I, on the other hand, was the shadow. I was the one who worked late at the library while Julian was out spending his allowance. I was the one who noticed when the accounts didn't add up while Julian was praised for his vision. When I got into Northwestern University on a scholarship, my father didn't congratulate me. He simply said, "I suppose someone has to be the academic, but don't expect us to fly up there for every little thing." So, I left. I packed my life into a trunk and drove north until the humid air of Georgia was a distant memory. I built a career in Chicago as a senior forensic auditor. I learned how to track money through walls of stone and layers of lies. I learned that people think they are being clever when they hide things in plain sight, but numbers never lie. They have a rhythm, a heartbeat, and if you listen closely enough, they tell you exactly who is stealing. I only came back for Great-Aunt Martha. She was the matriarch, the woman who actually built the wealth my brother was so busy pretending to manage. She was sharp, elegant, and had a memory like a steel trap. While the rest of the family treated me like an outsider, Martha saw me. She'd sit in her garden, sipping iced tea, and ask me about the complex audits I was running in the city. She'd listen with a glimmer in her eye that I didn't understand at the time. She once told me, "Alina, the tall trees catch the most wind, but it's the roots that decide who survives the storm. Never forget that Julian is all leaves and no root." She passed away 6 months ago. The funeral was a circus of performative grief. Julian gave a eulogy that was more about his future leadership than Martha's life. My parents stood by him like Secret Service agents, shielding their precious heir. I stood in the back, mourning the only person who truly knew me. After the service, my mother pulled me aside and told me there would be a meeting to settle the estate in a few months. Her voice was cold, already treating me like a stranger. I realized then that they had already decided my fate. They thought because I lived 1,000 miles away, I had no claim to the dirt I was born on. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that 3 years before she died, Aunt Martha called me. She didn't call the golden son. She called the auditor. She told me she had noticed discrepancies in the rental incomes Julian was supposed to be overseeing. She asked me to fly down secretly and look at the books. What I found was a systematic bleeding of the estate. Julian wasn't managing the properties. He was treating them like a personal ATM to fund a lifestyle of luxury cars and high-stakes gambling. He had embezzled nearly $2 million over 5 years, hiding it under renovations that never happened and maintenance fees paid to shell companies. When I showed Martha the proof, she didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. She simply looked at me and said, "The law of the harvest, Alina. You reap what you sow. Julian has sown greed. Your parents have sown blindness. Now we shall sow the truth." That weekend, in the quiet of her study, she bypassed the family lawyers. We worked with a private firm out of Atlanta. She didn't just change her will, she moved the entire portfolio into an irrevocable trust. She transferred the deeds of all 12 properties into my name, effective immediately upon her death, with a life estate clause for herself. She made me swear a blood oath that I would not utter a single word until the family attempted to distribute the assets. She knew them better than I did. She knew they would try to cut me out. She knew Julian would lie to my parents and tell them he was the only one capable of holding the legacy together. "Let them show their hearts first," she whispered. "Let them reveal exactly who they are when they think the prize is in their hands. Only then, Alina, do you show them the paper." For 3 years, I carried that secret like a hidden blade. I watched Julian post photos of his estates on Instagram. I listened to my father brag about how Julian was expanding the empire. I received the cold emails from my mother asking me to sign preliminary waivers of interest so they could streamline the transition. I ignored them all. I worked my job in Chicago, I saved my money, and I waited. I waited for the moment when their arrogance would reach its peak, and that moment was today. As I stood in that dining room, the smell of Julian's expensive cologne clashing with the salt air from the window, I felt the weight of the folders in my bag. I looked at the 30 people who had just cheered for my disinheritance. I saw my cousins whispering, probably wondering if I'd even be invited to the wedding Julian and Chloe were planning with my money. I saw the map on the wall with Julian's initials marked on every property. "Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden quiet, "you spent so much time pretending to be the owner that you forgot to check if the owner was actually dead. And Dad, you trusted the son who told you what you wanted to hear, instead of the daughter who told you the truth." I reached into my bag and pulled out the first document, the one that would turn this celebration into a funeral for their reputations. I didn't just pull out one piece of paper, I pulled out 12. One for every estate, every brick, and every square inch of the Thorne legacy. I laid them out on the mahogany table, covering the silk runner, right next to Julian's half-empty champagne glass. My father leaned forward, his face a mask of confusion that was slowly shifting into irritation. "Alina, what is this nonsense? We've already gone over the legalities with the estate attorney. Julian is the successor. It's done. Is it?" I asked, my voice as cold as a Chicago winter. "Because these are certified copies of quitclaim deeds, recorded and stamped by the county clerk over 2 years ago. And this," I pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder, "is the Thorne Sovereign Trust." It was finalized while Aunt Martha was very much alive, very much sane, and very much aware that her nephew was robbing her blind. Julian laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're delusional. I've been running these properties for years. I have the keys." "I have the books. You have the keys, Julian, but you don't have the title," I countered. I turned to the family attorney, Mr. Sterling, who was sitting at the far end of the table looking like he wanted to crawl into a hole. "Mr. Sterling, you weren't involved in this particular filing because Aunt Martha specifically requested a firm that wasn't on the Thorne payroll. But as a man of the law, I invite you to examine the seals on these documents. Tell the room, who actually owns the Oakwood estate? Who owns the Savannah Wharf buildings? Who owns the house we are sitting in right now?" The room stayed so silent you could hear the distant cry of a seagull outside. Sterling stood up with trembling hands. He walked over, adjusted his spectacles, and began to flip through the deeds. His face went from pale to ghostly white. He didn't even get through the 3rd page before he looked up at my father. "Thomas, these are legitimate. They are ironclad. The properties were transferred out of Martha's personal estate and into this trust years ago. Alina is the sole beneficiary and the only successor trustee. The will you're looking at, it's empty. There are no assets left in the estate to give to Julian. They already belong to Alina." The explosion I expected didn't happen right away. Instead, there was a terrible, hollow silence. It was the sound of 30 people realizing they had just cheered for a ghost. Chloe, Julian's fiancée, was the first to break it. What do you mean, belong to Alina? We've already booked the caterer for the wedding at the Oakwood Gardens. That's our house. Actually, Chloe, I said, tilting my head, that's my garden. And considering you just spent the last 20 minutes smirking at me while my brother told me I was nothing, I'd suggest you find a public park for your wedding, or perhaps a courthouse. They're much cheaper. Julian's face turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. He lunged across the table, his hand reaching for the documents, but I swiped them away just in time. You forged these, you manipulated an old woman in her final days. This is elder abuse. I'll have you in jail for this. Elder abuse. I stood my ground, not moving an inch as he loomed over me. Let's talk about abuse, Julian. Let's talk about the renovation of the Pier Street apartments that cost $300,000 on paper. But when I visited last year, the roof was still leaking, and the tenants told me they hadn't seen a contractor in a decade. Where did that money go, Julian? Was it the offshore gambling account, or was it the down payment on that silver Porsche you're so proud of? My mother let out a strangled gasp. Julian, tell her she's lying. Tell her you didn't. But Julian couldn't tell her anything. His eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. The golden sun was tarnished, the plating peeling off right in front of the people who had invested their entire identity into his success. My father finally stood up. He didn't look angry anymore, he looked broken. Alina, if this is true, if you own everything, why didn't you say anything? Why let us go through with this? Why let us host this party? Because, I said, feeling the sting of 20 years of neglect finally boiling over, I wanted to see exactly how much you were willing to give me when you thought I had nothing. I wanted to see if there was a single ounce of fairness in this family. I gave you every chance. When you sent those waivers to Chicago, I called you, Dad. I asked if we could talk about a fair split. You told me to stop being greedy and worry about my own little life. You chose your side. You chose the thief over the daughter who actually cared about the legacy. I looked around the room. My aunts and uncles, the ones who had been clapping for Julian just minutes ago, were now avoiding my gaze. They were looking at the floor, at their champagne, at their expensive watches. They were the vultures of the Thorne family, and they just realized the carcass they were planning to feast on was alive and had teeth. So here's how this is going to work, I announced, my voice commanding the room in a way Julian's never could. As of this moment, Julian, you are fired. You will hand over every key, every password, and every ledger by 5 p.m. today. If a single cent is missing from the operating accounts from this morning forward, I won't just sue you. I will hand the forensic audit I've been preparing for 3 years directly to the district attorney. And trust me, I have enough to send you away for a very long time. Julian looked at my father, his voice cracking. Dad, do something. You're the patriarch. You can't let her do this. My father looked at the deeds on the table, then at the daughter he had dismissed for a lifetime. He looked at the legal seals that stripped him of his power. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that in his world of leaves, I was the only one with roots. And as for the rest of you, I said, looking at the shocked relatives, the party is over. The catering is paid for by the estate, which is to say, by me, so feel free to take a go bag on your way out. But don't expect an invitation to the next meeting. There won't be one. The Thorne properties are no longer a family playground. They are a business, and I am the CEO. The room began to clear with a frantic, embarrassed energy. People scurried out like rats from a sinking ship. Chloe was already halfway to the driveway, shouting into her phone at her wedding planner. But Julian stayed. He sat in his chair, staring at the empty champagne glass, his world collapsing in real time. You think you're so smart, he hissed when we were finally alone with my parents and Mr. Sterling. You think you can just come in here and take over? The tenants love me. The city knows me. You're a ghost from Chicago. The tenants don't love you, Julian. They fear the eviction notices you use as threats. And the city knows the Thorne name. They'll learn my name soon enough, but they'll associate it with integrity, not embezzlement. I turned to my mother, who was still weeping silently. I'm going to my hotel now. Tomorrow, I'll be at the main office. I expect the locks to be changed by then. I picked up my suitcase and the folder of deeds. As I walked toward the door, I felt lighter than I had in years. The air in Savannah was still thick and humid, but for the first time I could breathe. I reached the front porch and looked out at the moss-draped oaks. I was no longer the shadow, but the real battle was only beginning. Because Julian wasn't just a thief, he was a desperate man. And as I got into my car, I saw him watching me from the upstairs window, his face twisted in a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He wasn't going to go quietly. He was going to try to tear down the house just so I couldn't live in it. The next morning, the sun rose over Savannah with a deceptive warmth, but the atmosphere inside the Thorn Realty headquarters was frigid. I arrived at 8:00 a.m. sharp, wearing a suit that felt like armor. I wasn't alone. Behind me walked two security guards I'd hired from a private firm and a locksmith who carried a heavy bag of tools. As we stepped into the lobby, the receptionist, a woman named Brenda who had worked for my father for 20 years, looked up with wide, red-rimmed eyes. She knew, in a town like this, news travels faster than the tide. "Miss Alina," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Julian is in the back office. He's been here since dawn. He said not to let anyone in." "Thank you, Brenda," I said firmly. "You might want to take an early lunch. Things are about to get loud." I didn't wait for her to respond. I headed straight for the executive suite, the mahogany-paneled inner sanctum where Julian had played king for the last 5 years. I didn't knock. I pushed the double doors open to find a scene of absolute chaos. Filing cabinets were swung open, papers were scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, and the shredder in the corner was humming with a frantic, mechanical hunger. Julian was at the desk, his tie undone, his hair disheveled, desperately stuffing folders into a leather briefcase. "Stop," I said. The word echoed off the high ceilings. Julian jumped, dropping a stack of papers. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the boy who used to hide my toys just to watch me cry. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose greed had finally hit a wall. "You have no right to be here," he screamed. "This is my office. These are my files." "Actually," I said, gesturing to the security guards who moved to flank the door, "this building is owned by the Thorn Sovereign Trust. Every staple, every paperclip, and every file in this room belongs to the trust. And as successor trustee, I am officially revoking your access." "Move away from the desk, Julian. I'm the manager," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You can't just fire me without cause." "I have 2 million causes, Julian," I replied, pulling a tablet from my bag. I tapped the screen and turned it toward him. "I spent all night reviewing the digital backups Aunt Martha secretly set up years ago. I see the transfers to the Palmetto Development Group. That's your shell company, isn't it? The one registered in the Cayman Islands? I've already flagged the last 3 months of transactions. You weren't just taking a cut, you were trying to drain the reserve accounts before I could get to them." Julian's face went from frantic to murderous. He lunged at me, but the guards were faster. They caught him by the arms, pinning him back against the desk. He thrashed, swearing, his dignity dissolving into a pathetic display of entitlement. "Search the briefcase," I told the guards. Inside, they found more than just files. They found $10,000 in cash, the original property titles Aunt Martha had kept in her personal safe, and a set of keys to the luxury coastal estate Julian had claimed as his own. I took the keys and set them on the desk. "Get him out of here," I said, "and if he sets foot on any Thorn property again, call the police immediately. I've already filed the trespassing injunctions." As they dragged him out, Julian turned his head, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "You think you've won, Alina? You think the family is just going to let you walk away with everything? Dad is calling a meeting of the board. They'll strip you of that trust so fast your head will spin. You're nothing but a thief in a fancy suit." I watched him go, then I sat in the chair he had occupied. It was still warm. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced it down. This wasn't about winning, it was about survival. I looked at the mess he'd left behind. It was a perfect metaphor for his management, superficial, messy, and built on destruction. By noon, the locksmith had changed every door in the building. By 2:00 p.m., I had the IT department, who were more than happy to help once I showed them their back pay would finally be processed, lock Julian and my father out of the servers. But the real storm hit at 4:00 p.m. when my father walked in. He didn't come in shouting. He walked in slowly, looking like a man who had lost his way in his own home. He stood in the doorway of the office, staring at me. "Alina," he said softly, "your mother is a wreck. She's in bed, sedated. Julian is at a bar, telling anyone who will listen that you've robbed us. Is this really how you want to be remembered? As the daughter who destroyed her family for a few pieces of dirt? I didn't destroy this family, Dad, I said, not rising from the chair. I'm the only one trying to save what's left of it. Julian was going to lead you into a federal indictment. If I hadn't stepped in, the IRS would have seized everything within 18 months. Aunt Martha saw it. Why couldn't you? Because he's my son. He bellowed, his voice finally finding its power. He belongs here. You were always looking for a reason to leave. You hated this city, you hated our traditions. Why come back now just to tear it all down? I came back because Martha asked me to. And I stayed because someone had to be the adult in the room. You want to talk about traditions? Tradition is about honor. It's about taking care of the people who pay their rent so their children can have a roof. Julian forgot that. You forgot that. My father stepped closer, leaning over the desk. I'm still the head of this family, Alina. I have friends in the courthouse. I have friends in the legislature. We will fight this trust. We will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years until you're old and gray and broke. Give it up now. Give Julian the coastal properties and you can keep the rest. We can tell the family it was a misunderstanding. We can be a family again. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the desperation of a man who realized his golden son was a fraud, but was too proud to admit he'd been wrong. He was offering me a bribe to keep the lie alive. The answer is no, I said. And if you try to sue me, I will release the forensic audit. I've kept your name out of the discrepancies so far, Dad. I've assumed you were just blind, not complicit. But if you force my hand in court, I will have to testify about everything. Do you really want the Thorne name dragged through a criminal trial? Do you want to spend your retirement in a deposition chair? My father's shoulders slumped. The threat worked, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. He turned without another word and walked out. I watched him go, knowing that the bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized. That night I stayed late at the office, going through the real books. The deeper I went, the worse it got. Julian hadn't just embezzled, he had neglected the properties to a dangerous degree. There were outstanding fire code violations, unpaid property taxes, and 3 lawsuits from tenants that had been settled with hush money that was never actually paid. I was leaning back, rubbing my eyes when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it and my heart stopped. It was a photo of my apartment building in Chicago. Underneath, a single sentence. It's a long way down from the top floor, Alina. Be careful how you step. I knew it was Julian. He wasn't just going to fight me in the boardroom. He was going to take this into the shadows. I looked out the window at the dark Savannah streets, the Spanish moss swaying in the wind like hanging nooses. I realized then that I wasn't just managing an estate anymore. I was in a war. I didn't panic. In my line of work, you learn that threats are just another form of data. They reveal the sender's desperation. I saved the image, backed it up to 3 different cloud servers, and sent it directly to my contact at the Chicago PD and a private security firm I'd put on retainer the moment I crossed the Georgia border. If Julian thought a grainy photo of my home would make me pack my bags and run, he'd forgotten who actually survived the Thorne dinner table all those years. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the hunter. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of legal fire and brimstone. I didn't wait for Julian to make his move. I went on the offensive. I called an emergency meeting with the board of the local bank that held the operating lines for the Thorne estates. When I walked into that wood-paneled boardroom, the men around the table looked at me like I was a glitch in their system. They were used to my father's golf course handshakes and Julian's empty promises. "Gentlemen," I said, sliding the forensic summary across the table, "you have 2 choices. You can continue to extend credit to a man who has been laundering your loan draws into offshore accounts, or you can work with the new successor trustee to stabilize these assets. If you choose the former, I will be moving all Thorne Sovereign Trust accounts to a national bank in Atlanta by noon, and I will make sure the FDIC knows exactly why I'm leaving." The bank president, a man who had known my father since the Nixon administration, turned a shade of gray that matched his suit. Within an hour, Julian's credit cards were frozen, and the line of credit he'd been using as a personal slush fund was slammed shut. I was cutting off his oxygen, 1 valve at a time, but while I was winning the financial war, the emotional fallout was becoming a toxic cloud. My phone was a constant barrage of guilt. My mother sent voice notes, her voice thick with tears and wine, accusing me of killing my father's spirit. My cousins posted cryptic messages on Facebook about blood-sucking relatives and the greed of the North. Even Chloe, the jilted fiancée, went on a local Savannah socialite blog to claim I'd used dark magic and manipulation to trick a dying woman. I ignored it all until I got a call from Dylan. "Elena," he said, his voice sounding hollow. "You need to come to the old boathouse. Now, Julian's here and he's lost it. He's got a gas can, Elena. He says if he can't have the wharf properties, nobody will." My blood turned to ice. The wharf properties were the crown jewels of Martha's collection, historic warehouses converted into high-end lofts and galleries. They were the heart of the trust's value. If they burned, the entire financial structure I was trying to save would collapse, and more importantly, people lived in those lofts. I drove like a maniac through the narrow, cobblestone streets of the historic district. When I arrived, the smell of gasoline was already heavy in the humid air. The boathouse sat on the edge of the river, shadowed by the massive wharf buildings. I saw Julian's Porsche parked haphazardly in the grass, the driver's door wide open. I ran toward the docks. I saw Dylan standing near the edge, looking terrified. Julian was there, standing in the middle of the pier, his expensive silk shirt stained with sweat and fuel. He held a heavy brass lighter in one hand and a half-empty bottle of bourbon in the other. He looked like a man who had finally stepped off the edge of sanity. "Julian, stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking the heavy silence of the riverside. He spun around, laughing, a jagged, ugly sound. "Here she is, the queen of the Thorn Empire. Come to watch it all go up in smoke? There are families in those buildings, Julian, children." I stepped onto the pier, my hands raised. "This isn't just about money anymore. This is arson. This is attempted murder. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life in a cell?" "I'm already in a cell," he roared, splashing more gasoline onto the wooden pilings. "You put me there, you took my name, you took my future." "Dad won't even look at me, Elena. He looks at me like I'm a disease because you showed him the books. You broke him. He's broken because you lied to him for 5 years." I took another step forward. "I didn't do this to you, Julian. You did this, you spent the money, you neglected the tenants. You gambled with Aunt Martha's life's work. I'm just the one who stopped the clock." "Shut up," he flicked the lighter. A small, orange flame danced in the breeze. "I was the one who stayed. I was the one who did the work. You just sat in Chicago and judged us. You think you're so much better than us?" "I don't think I'm better," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I just think I'm honest. And I think Aunt Martha loved you enough to try and stop you before you did something you couldn't come back from. She didn't leave the properties to me to hurt you. She did it to save the family name from the scandal you were creating." Julian looked at the flame, then at the wharf buildings towering over us. For a second, I thought I saw a flash of the brother I used to have, the one who once protected me from a neighborhood dog. But then he looked at the bourbon bottle and took a long, staggering swig. "She hated me," he whimpered. "She always saw through me. She didn't hate you, Julian. She just knew you weren't ready for the weight of this." I was only 10 feet away now. I could see the tears streaming down his face, mixing with the grime. "Give me the lighter. We can figure this out. I'll hire the best lawyers for the embezzlement case. I'll make sure Mom and Dad are taken care of. Just don't do this." He looked at me, his eyes unfocused. The flame flickered, dangerously close to his sleeve. "You'd really help me, after everything? We're still the Thorn children, Julian. Even if the house is empty, we're the only ones who know what it was like to grow up in that shade." His hand trembled. The lighter began to slip from his fingers. I reached out, my heart hammering against my ribs. Just as he was about to hand it over, a police siren wailed in the distance. The sound triggered something in him. The fragile moment of connection shattered. His face hardened, the mask of rage snapping back into place. "You called them," he hissed. "You set me up again?" "No, Julian, I didn't." I looked back at Dylan, who was holding his phone with a guilty expression. Dylan had called them. He tried to be the hero, but he just pushed the pin back into the grenade. Julian didn't hesitate. He didn't drop the lighter. He threw the bourbon bottle at my feet, the glass shattering, and then he lunged, not at me but toward the gasoline-soaked pilings. "If I go down, the Thorn name goes down with me." He dropped the lighter. The world turned orange. A wall of heat slammed into me, throwing me backward onto the hard wood of the pier. The gasoline ignited with a roar, the flames leaping up the side of the boathouse and spreading toward the first wharf warehouse. I scrambled to my feet, coughing as the thick, black smoke filled my lungs. "Julian!" I screamed. I saw him standing at the edge of the fire, looking at the destruction with a horrifying expression of triumph. He didn't try to run. He just stood there as the flames began to lick at the hem of his trousers. "Dylan, help me." I grabbed a heavy moving blanket from the dock and soaked it in the river water. We ran into the heat. My skin felt like it was bubbling, my eyes stinging so badly I could barely see. We grabbed Julian by the shoulders and hauled him back, his body limp as we dragged him away from the inferno. We rolled him in the wet blanket just as the first fire truck screamed into the parking lot. I sat on the pavement, gasping for air, watching as the firefighters battled the blaze. They stopped it before it reached the main warehouses, but the boathouse, and a century of Thorne family history, was gone. As the paramedics loaded Julian into the ambulance, my father arrived. He didn't look at the fire, he didn't look at the ruins of his legacy. He walked straight to me, his face pale and lined with a grief I'd never seen before. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse me. He just stood there in the flickering light of the emergency strobes and asked, "Is he alive?" "Yes, Dad," I whispered. "He's alive." My father looked at the burning pier, then back at me. "Maybe it's better this way," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the hoses. "Maybe some things need to burn so we can finally see the ground." The fire didn't just consume the old boathouse. It burned away the final remnants of the Thorne family's carefully constructed facade. By the time the embers were cooling and the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, the story had changed forever. Julian was under police guard at the hospital, facing charges of first-degree arson and embezzlement. My parents were huddled in a small, sterile waiting room, stripped of their finery and their pride. I didn't go home. I went back to the wharf. I stood on the blackened pier, the smell of charred cedar clinging to my hair, and watched the tenants of the loft buildings emerge. They weren't angry, they were relieved. They had seen the truth. They saw the woman who had run into the fire to save the buildings they called home, and they saw the man who had tried to burn them down for a grudge. 3 months later, the transition was complete. Julian accepted a plea deal, 10 years with 5 suspended, provided he made full restitution of the embezzled funds. He's currently serving his time in a minimum security facility upstate. He doesn't call me, I don't visit. The silence between us is the only honest thing left. My parents moved out of the great estate. I didn't kick them out, they simply couldn't bear to live in a house that felt like a museum of their failures. They live in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the city now. I pay the taxes. I pay the insurance. I make sure they have what they need, but the warmth is gone. We speak on holidays, brief, polite conversations that hover on the surface of things. They finally see me, but they don't know how to love the person I've become, the woman who had to break them to save them. Chloe disappeared from the social scene entirely. I heard she moved to Charleston and married an insurance adjuster. I hope he keeps his books in order. As for me, I stayed in Savannah. I sold my condo in Chicago and moved into a small, sunlit apartment at the top of the very wharf building Julian tried to destroy. Every morning, I look out at the river. I see the new boathouse being built, not as a private playground for the wealthy, but as a community center for the children of the historic district. The Thorne Sovereign Trust is thriving. I hired a team of professionals who don't care about family names or country club memberships. We've repaired the leaking roofs, settled the old debts, and turned the 12 estates into a model of sustainable, ethical real estate. I am no longer the daughter who was left nothing. I am the woman who owns her destiny. I still keep Aunt Martha's fountain pen on my desk. Every time I sign a new lease or a community grant, I feel her presence. She was right, paper beats promises. But there's one thing she didn't tell me. She didn't tell me that the cost of the truth is often the family you thought you had. But as I sit on my balcony tonight, watching the lights of the city sparkle on the water, I realize that peace is worth more than any inheritance. I didn't just win the properties, I won my life back. And for the first time in 31 years, I don't have to look over my shoulder to see who's standing in my way. If you've ever had to set fire to your old life to find the person you were meant to be, then you know exactly why I'm smiling tonight. Because sometimes, the only way to build a real home is to make sure the foundation is made of truth, not gold. Thank you for listening to my story. My name is Alina Thorne, and this was the day the Thorne family finally grew up.